At exactly 6:28 in the morning, London's most famous timepiece went silent. The clock that had kept ticking through 2 world wars, through every crisis the nation had faced, simply stopped working. Ice and snow had jammed the mechanism completely. When people looked up at Big Ben that morning, they saw something they never thought possible: the hands frozen in place, unable to move forward. This was January 9, 1968. And this frozen clock was just the beginning of what would become one of Britain's most destructive winters on record. Nobody saw it coming. The first week of January felt normal. Cold weather, yes, but nothing alarming. People wore their winter coats and went about their daily routines. There was no reason to think anything unusual would happen. But weather patterns were shifting in ways forecasters hadn't predicted. January 8 changed everything. Snow started falling that afternoon across the southern parts of England. At first, it seemed like typical winter weather. But the snow kept coming. Hour after hour, it fell without stopping. Strong winds from the southeast pushed the snow into massive piles. By nightfall, it was clear this was no ordinary snowfall. When morning arrived on the 9th, England looked completely different. The snow had buried entire towns and cities. Some areas measured 30 centimeters of snow on level ground. But the real problem was the drifts. Wind had pushed the snow into huge mountains in some places, reaching 3 meters high. Roads disappeared under white blankets. Train tracks became unusable. Small villages found themselves completely isolated from the outside world. London faced chaos. The capital city ground to a halt. Transportation systems failed across the board. Trains couldn't move because ice covered the tracks. Buses couldn't complete their routes. Cars vanished under snow mounds, abandoned where they'd gotten stuck. Schools closed their doors. Factories told workers to stay home. The city that prided itself on keeping things running no matter what had been forced to stop. Inside homes, conditions were harsh. Families woke up to find frost coating their windows from the inside. Milk bottles left on doorsteps had frozen solid overnight. The cold penetrated everything. When people tried to leave their houses, they found snow piled so high against doors that getting out became a physical challenge. The wind made everything worse. Anyone brave enough to go outside described it as cutting through clothes like a knife. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Some people got trapped in their vehicles for hours, unable to move forward or backward through the deep snow. Others had to abandon their cars entirely and walk through snow that reached their waists, trying desperately to find help or reach safety. But British people responded the way they always had during hard times. They helped each other. Neighbors grabbed shovels and started digging out the elderly folks on their street. Complete strangers worked together to push stuck cars free. Postal workers still tried to deliver mail, even when they couldn't reach every address. Life moved slowly, but it kept moving. People made tea and carried on. The country started recovering. Slowly, roads got cleared. Train lines reopened. Things began returning to normal. People thought the worst had passed. They were wrong. Far out in the Atlantic Ocean, something dangerous was forming. Meteorologists tracking weather patterns noticed a low-pressure system developing near Bermuda. This wasn't unusual in itself. These systems form regularly over the ocean. But this particular system started acting strangely. The system moved northward, passing near the Azores Islands. Weather experts watched it but saw nothing alarming. The pressure system looked weak and manageable. They expected it to continue north and pass harmlessly above Scotland, missing the mainland completely. Their forecasts predicted no major danger. Then everything changed in less than 1 day. The storm intensified with shocking speed. The pressure dropped 50 millibars in just hours, a massive change that indicated something extremely powerful was developing. The storm raced across the Atlantic Ocean at incredible velocity, heading straight towards Scotland. By the time meteorologists realized what was happening, there was no time to warn anyone properly. On the evening of January 14th, the storm shifted direction. Instead of passing safely to the north as predicted, it turned eastward. Its new path aimed it directly at central Scotland. The country had no idea what was about to hit. January 15th arrived quietly. Most Scottish families were asleep in their beds. The night seemed calm. Normal. Safe. But around 3 o'clock in the morning, everything changed in an instant. The storm slammed into Glasgow first. Wind speeds exceeded 100 miles per hour, strong enough to be classified as hurricane force. Scotland had never experienced anything like this. The winds didn't just blow hard, they destroyed everything in their path. Roofs got ripped off buildings as if they weighed nothing. Chimneys that had stood for decades suddenly collapsed. These weren't small structures, some weighed 3 tons of solid brick and stone. They crashed through roofs, smashing downward through multiple floors, sometimes reaching all the way to basement levels. Windows exploded inward. Entire walls came down. Trees that had survived for generations snapped like they were made of twigs. The city lost all electrical power immediately. Power lines came down everywhere, plunging Glasgow into complete darkness. Emergency services struggled to respond because they couldn't see what was happening. A police spokesman would later describe the scene with just 2 words: absolute havoc. People woke up terrified. The sound alone was horrifying: wind screaming through streets, timber cracking, masonry crashing to the ground. Families had no warning, no time to escape. They woke to find their homes collapsing around them. On Dumbarton Road, tragedy struck hard. A mother and her young daughter, just 4 years old, were visiting from England to attend a funeral. A chimney fell through the roof while they slept. Both died instantly. In the house next door, another mother and her 10-year-old daughter suffered the same fate. Rescue workers needed 12 hours to recover their bodies from the wreckage. Similar scenes played out across the city. A pregnant nurse died when falling masonry crashed through her apartment. A 5-year-old girl in Anderson. A man in Charing Cross. A woman in Cross Hill. The deaths kept adding up throughout that terrible night. By morning, 20 people across Scotland had lost their lives. 9 of those deaths happened in Glasgow alone. But death was only part of the horror. The physical destruction was staggering. Over 300 houses in Glasgow were completely destroyed, not damaged, but completely gone. 70,000 homes suffered damage of some kind. That represented half of all the council housing in the entire city. Half. Edinburgh didn't escape either. The Scott Monument, one of the city's most famous landmarks, lost one of its tall decorative spires. Churches collapsed. Schools sustained heavy damage. Factory buildings crumbled. Nothing remained untouched. People who lived through the Clydebank Blitz during World War II said the destruction looked similar. German bombers had caused that devastation. This time, only wind did the damage. Outside the cities, forests took massive hits. Forestry Commission officials counted 8,000 hectares of destroyed woodland. In the Central Belt alone, over 1,000 mature trees came down. On the River Clyde, 7 ships sank during the storm. An oil drilling rig called Sequest broke free from its moorings and drifted in rough seas. The storm's effects reached across the water to Denmark, where 8 more people died. When morning light finally came on January 15th, people stepped outside to see their world transformed. Streets filled with piles of broken brick and stone. Cars sat crushed beneath fallen walls. Lampposts bent at impossible angles. Dust hung thick in the air. The smell of broken buildings was everywhere. This was Scotland's worst natural disaster in recorded history. And nobody had predicted it. The human toll went beyond those who died that night. In the weeks following the storm, 30 more people lost their lives. These were roofers and builders and ordinary men trying to repair damaged homes. They fell from roofs. They got crushed when weakened walls collapsed. They died trying to fix the buildings that the storm had broken. 700 people had nowhere to live immediately after the storm. Thousands more lived in houses with holes in the roofs, covered only by tarps that barely kept out rain and wind. Hospitals gave up their mattresses so displaced families could sleep in school gymnasiums. Churches opened up for shelter. Community centers became temporary housing. The government response was insulting. Prime Minister Harold Wilson's administration offered Scotland an interest-free loan of £500,000. A loan, not a grant, for damage estimated at £30 million. The previous year, when an oil tanker called the Tory Canyon sank off the coast at Land's End, the government had immediately provided £1.5 million. But Scotland, only 400 miles from London, didn't get the same treatment. National newspapers in England barely covered the story. A hurricane-force storm that destroyed a major British city hardly made the front pages. Scotland felt ignored and abandoned by the rest of Britain. Despite this, Scottish people responded with remarkable strength. The army sent 150 soldiers from Edinburgh to help with clean-up operations. Singer Frankie Vaughan organised a benefit concert at the Alhambra Theatre to raise money. Neighbours who barely knew each other before worked side by side removing rubble. Strangers opened their homes to people who had lost everything. There was no panic. No looting. Just quiet determination to rebuild what had been destroyed. That's what people did. They picked up the broken pieces. They patched holes in roofs. They carried on with life. There was no other choice. The January storm of 1968 forced changes across Britain. The Met Office felt embarrassed about failing to predict the storm's path correctly. They invested heavily in better technology and improved forecasting models. New warning systems got developed to prevent similar surprises in the future. Building regulations underwent major overhauls. New rules required stronger roofs. Construction standards had to account for extreme wind scenarios. Glasgow City Council used the disaster as justification to push through housing improvements they'd been wanting to make for years. The old tenement buildings that had collapsed so easily got marked for demolition. Plans for new housing estates moved forward. In a twisted way, the storm became a catalyst that forced needed changes. But for the people who lived through those terrible hours, improvements couldn't change what had happened. Nothing could bring back the 20 people who died that night. Nothing could erase the memory of waking up to find your home destroyed, your street unrecognizable, your entire city broken. Ask anyone who was there and they'll tell you about the sounds. The wind roaring like a freight train approaching at full speed. Wood snapping. Heavy masonry crashing to the ground. Then afterward came an eerie silence as the sun rose over devastated Glasgow. They'll also tell you about the smell, dust mixed with broken plaster, wet wood, the distinct odor of destruction that hung in the air for days. The winter of 1967 to 1968 wasn't Britain's coldest winter on record. It wasn't the snowiest either. But it was possibly the most violent. Two separate disasters struck within just 2 weeks. First came the blizzard that paralyzed the south. Then came the storm that devastated the north. For several days in January, Britain received a harsh reminder that nature doesn't care about human plans or weather forecasts or confidence. When wind decides to blow at full force, when snow decides to fall without stopping, humans can only try to survive. Other winters get remembered more often. The Great Freeze of 1963 appears in history books. The Winter of Discontent in 1979 gets discussed frequently. But the winter of 1968 remains burned into Scottish memory. That's the winter when a storm arrived with almost no warning and transformed everything in just 2 hours. That's the winter that proved even Big Ben, the symbol of British reliability, could freeze solid and stop working. That winter taught Britain an uncomfortable truth. The nation was never as prepared as it believed itself to be. Weather could still catch the country completely off guard. Nature could still bring a major city to its knees in a single night. All the technology and confidence and pride couldn't protect against forces that powerful. The people who survived those weeks in January 1968 never forgot what they experienced. They carried those memories for the rest of their lives. The sound of the wind. The sight of their neighborhoods transformed into disaster zones. The feeling of helplessness as nature showed its power. And the resilience required to rebuild from such complete destruction. For younger generations who didn't live through it, the winter of 1968 serves as a reminder. It shows that disaster can strike anywhere, anytime, even in a modern developed nation. It demonstrates the importance of preparation, accurate forecasting, and strong community bonds. Most importantly, it proves that when everything falls apart, ordinary people working together can rebuild what seemed impossible to fix. The scars from that winter eventually healed. Buildings got repaired or replaced. Streets got cleaned. Life returned to normal. But Scotland never forgot. And Britain learned lessons that improved safety for everyone who came after. Sometimes it takes a disaster to force necessary change. The winter of 1968 was that disaster, the storm that Scotland will always remember.